Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Blinded by Logic. We all know birth rates are dropping drastically all over the world. But the big question is, what comes next? Because for the first time in modern history, many countries aren't just facing slower population growth, but as of 2024, about 40 countries are facing outright population decline, and that list is growing each year. This is a massive shift, pushing entire societies to a crossroads. How we respond to this could lead us towards better lives where people are encouraged to have kids, or it can lead us down a path towards authoritarian control and, frankly, a bleak future. So let's look at the numbers again. Back in the 1960s, the global fertility rate was around 5 children per woman. Today, it's about 2.2, barely above the 2.1 children needed just to replace the population. But 2.2, that average, hides huge differences. Virtually all the developed world lives in countries where the birth rate is below replacement levels. In fact, every continent outside of Africa and Oceania have fertility rates below replacement levels, with North America and Europe each at about 1.6. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation suggests the global population might peak in the mid-2060s based on how rapidly fertility rates continue to drop, and they fall at about 2% per year on average for over the past 55 years, and that 2% drop per year has held true as well in recent years. If that decline continues, we could see a total fertility rate around 1.3 by 2050 and a rapidly declining global population before 2060. Whether this actually happens, though, depends heavily on political choices and where the path splits. We're seeing two main potential responses emerge. One is what we could call a democratic upgrade, focusing on human well-being, creating a world where people want to have kids. And the other is an authoritarian control path, focused on state power, where rules are in place to try to force people to have kids. So let's first consider the democratic upgrade path. In countries where governments are generally accountable to their citizens and individual rights are respected, a shrinking population could actually bring improvements. As the number of the working age people declines relative to the number of jobs available, workers naturally gain more bargaining power and potentially higher wages, where employers who need talent have to compete harder. And this could lead to higher real wages, especially after decades like we saw in the US, where productivity has risen sharply, but workers saw minimal gains. Recognizing that people are the key assets, governments and businesses would face serious pressure to invest heavily in education. And this starts from early childhood, where studies show quality programs can lead to returns of $4 to $9 for every dollar invested in these kids through better lifelong outcomes. We could see pushes for expanded social safety nets. Think about affordable childcare right now. It can cost US families anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 per year per child in many states. And compare that to a country like France, which spends around 3.6% of its GDP on family benefits, including heavily subsidizing daycares. Comprehensive paid parental leave can also be a crucial step, where a country like Sweden is already offering 480 days of shared leave between parents. And real solutions to the housing crisis are vital. US home prices shot up nearly 50% between 2020 and 2023, making stable housing a huge challenge for potential parents worldwide. Democracies might also get serious about tackling the future of work itself, maybe considering things like universal basic income, where governments provide a basic income where people can afford stuff like food and housing, or perhaps implementing shorter work weeks to improve work-life balance. And the impact of artificial intelligence remains uncertain, but that's kind of the big wild card here. And some are predicting that AI could automate tasks equivalent to 300 million full-time jobs globally by 2030, and as much as 50% of jobs could be automated by 2045. So while the future for AI is uncertain, you still need a population to consume goods and services. So humanity will always have some kind of economic value for humans, even if it is just as consumers. To counter shrinking workforces and maintain living standards, democracies may have to increasingly rely on immigration. Foreign-born workers already constitute huge parts of the labor force in a lot of countries, 18.6% in the US, over 23% in Canada, and nearly 30% in Australia. And this strategy offers immediate economic gains, where you bypass the roughly 20 years you would normally have to spend raising and educating a child. Instead, you have a 20-year-old immigrant come in and provide labor, skilled labor in many cases, immediately. And yes, this is going to potentially cause social friction over cultural change and resource competition. The demographic reality of low birth rates, though, makes attracting skilled labor a near necessity for maintaining economic livelihood in a lot of countries, especially with declining populations. Expect continued competition among developed nations to offer attractive living standards and policies to draw the needed global talent as their own populations age and decline. Now, let's contrast this with the authoritarian path. In regimes where power is centralized, individual rights are secondary to the state, and dissent is not tolerated. Falling birth rates in these societies will be seen very differently. They are viewed as national weakness, a direct threat to state power and geopolitical standing. So the response isn't in investing in people, it's in controlling them. Reproductive freedom is often the first target. We will see tighter restrictions and even outright bans on contraception and abortion. Look at Russia. It's facing demographic decline. Its population is down over 5 million people since the 1990s. And estimates suggest hundreds of thousands, maybe over 1 million people, have been lost due to the war in Ukraine and emigration recently. In response, Russia has significantly tightened its abortion laws, pressuring clinics and pushing anti-abortion rhetoric, and its fertility rate still remains low, around 1.4, very much well below the 2.1 replacement level. And consider Hungary under Viktor Orban. The government there explicitly links its aggressive pronatalist policies, things like a lifetime income tax exemption for women who have 4 or more children, or subsidized loans that get forgiven if you have kids, with a nationalist ideology and restrictions on LGBTQ rights. But even these are very expensive policies that cost nearly 5% of Hungary's GDP, and they have only nudged the fertility rate up a modest amount to around 1.5, still very much well below replacement levels. Or let's consider China. After decades of their one-child policy, they shifted to a 2-child policy in 2016 and then a 3-child policy in 2021. They added some incentives like longer parental leave and some subsidies, but these top-down measures have been largely unsuccessful thus far. The birth rate is still around 1.0, and it shows limits of state commands when the underlying economic and social realities discourage people from having more children. And in China's case, social norms change, where many people wanted fewer kids, in part because the one-child policy influenced China's norms on having smaller families. Under authoritarian regimes, expect more state propaganda pushing larger families, often targeted at preferred ethnic or national groups. Expect intense social pressure against being childless, or delaying marriage. And potentially these countries might even restrict emigration, trapping their population inside. One of the most chilling historical examples of this authoritarian approach was Romania under Nicolae Ceausescu. Seeking to boost Romania's population, Ceausescu implemented deeply invasive policies starting in 1966. The cornerstone was Decree 770, which basically banned abortion and contraception for most women under 45 years of age who had fewer than 4 children. And enforcement was brutal. Mandatory gynecological exams in workplaces to detect pregnancies and prevent abortions. Even taxes on people without children. And yes, these coercive policies did cause a temporary shift in birth rates, jumping from 1.9 to 3.7 children per woman between 1966 and 1967. But the human cost was horrific. Women died from unsafe, illegal abortions, and Romania's maternal mortality rate skyrocketed to become the highest in Europe. After Ceausescu's regime collapsed in 1989, these policies were reversed, and Romania's fertility rate plummeted fast, dropping to around 1.3 by the mid-1990s. This sharp drop wasn't just about access to contraception. It reflected a societal trauma, a backlash against decades of the state controlling the most personal life decisions, combined with post-communist economic chaos that created deep levels of uncertainty. The Romanian example shows that trying to engineer society requires more and more draconian measures, either risking a collapse or a bleak dystopian state that sacrifices freedom for forced order. And perhaps most dangerously, authoritarian states that feel demographically weak or see shrinking populations could become militarily aggressive. If you can't grow your population from within, maybe your only option is to resort to external expansion, seizing resources, territory, and crucially, people, trying to offset your own decline through conquest and forced assimilation. And so while the reasons are complex, it's hard to completely separate Russia's invasion of Ukraine from its long-term demographic decline. Russia's population has declined by about 5 million people since the early 1990s. So it stands to reason, at least from Moscow's perspective, the quickest path to gain population might seem to be conquering and absorbing neighboring populations, like Ukraine's, which had a population of over 40 million before the invasion happened. So whatever casualties Russia may suffer, if they're able to absorb even part of Ukraine and gain their resources and their people, they could still gain far more people than whatever they lose, and at least partially reverse their own declining population numbers. Realistically, coercion fuels hopelessness, not baby making. And we know that high economic costs are a big reason why people are having fewer kids. But if a country just tries to offer incentives like a one-time payment of $5,000 or $10,000 cash money to have a child, that may increase birth rates in the short term, but it risks creating a truly dystopian outcome where children are being conceived by the most financially desperate people just for a state paycheck. The unforeseen problems could be massive, especially if children are born in situations where they are not wanted. And so maybe the most important takeaway to understand about falling birth rates and the potential population decline is this. Governments and businesses want people to have kids as workers and as consumers. If populations are growing, governments and those with enough wealth to influence the political system can effectively treat people like renewable resources, like trees that they can just cut down and grow back. They can send people to war without a second thought. But If a population is suddenly declining, then you are losing workers and consumers. So something like war becomes a less rational choice. If a population is in decline, then the lives of each person is worth far more to governments than if they are endlessly reproducing like rabbits. As humans go from renewable resources to finite assets, at some point, governments might actually have to start caring about their people and protecting and empowering their people, and to try to create a world where people actually want to have kids. Or perhaps they could go down the path where they try to control their population to have more kids. Ultimately, the path taken isn't set in stone. Different nations will choose different strategies. The future really depends on the choices being made right now, on the strength of democratic institutions, on whether citizens demand policies focusing on well-being. We're talking about a potential transition to a more equitable world where every individual can truly thrive, where everyone is prioritized, versus a slide into repression, conflict, and the denial of basic human rights. The bottom line is a deeply authoritarian government that heavily restricts human action has proven to be a failure compared to countries where political and economic power are more evenly distributed throughout society. Authoritarian governments ultimately create a sense of hopelessness for much of the population, especially when it comes to creating a world where people want to have a family. And we can look at authoritarian measures from the countries that we mentioned earlier: Russia, Hungary, Romania. Guess what? They all have seen their populations decline dramatically in the past 20 to 30 years. So now we are really at a point where we can choose our future. You could say we're in a time for choosing. Like, do we want a world that becomes more free, where people are empowered and supported to start families if they choose to? Or will we go down a path of increasing authoritarian control where we lose our ability to shape our own destinies? Next time, we'll discuss in more detail what countries could actually do to reverse falling fertility rates without having to resort to authoritarian measures. This has been Blinded by Logic. Thanks for watching.